Well, you can play that. Yeah, exactly.
It's Julie's, and I never know if I need it right.
So if she comes over here. That weight gain between Thanksgiving and except for her. But she just.
I'm not even sure really.
Sorry.
You all good?
Yeah, that really is helpful. So, call me if you yeah, it's pretty nice.
And leaving messages for somebody named Ebony, and I'm just back around. Nobody here by the name of somebody.
There's no one watching currently.
Good morning, everybody. Hey, everybody. Happy December the 1st. Yay. Can anybody tell me what today is?
December 1st.
What is it?
December 1st.
I can't
can't hear you.
Trivia question?
That's the trivia question. We're all going to sing some Christmas songs today, so they go right in front of you. We're going to do the first Noel. And what child is this?
Son.
Good job. Good job. All right. Thanks, Julie. Oh, I forgot one thing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Julie. Happy birthday to you.
And many more.
Speaking of Julie, so Julie's son Scott runs a Chick-fil-A.
Yes.
So one of the gifts that they're doing this year, one of the things they're doing, right? Okay. So this is going to be our prize today. This is a card that the winner will get today. And in there, it says, a gift so sweet it's meant to be shared, but it's M-I-N-T, meant. So what it is, it's a gift card for a free peppermint milkshake. And then but it's one for you and one you give to somebody else. Yes. So that's the prize for today. Oh, and there's a recipe in it as well to make a, what is it, a peppermint?
Chocolate pie.
Peppermint chocolate pie. There's a recipe in there as well. Yeah, Oreo cookie crust. All the things I can't eat. Yay! All right, so the trivia question, you'll see all the staff names here. Staff names
Here we
here.
go.
All right, this, it could be any of us.
Yeah.
So, I asked the staff members their favorite Christmas gift ever. Well, I asked this person. And this person said that it was when the mother of this person, I gotta make sure I don't say he or she, the mother of this person gave this person an ornament and has continued giving ornaments every year, but it was a special design. I can't give you any more details about the ornament, but it was a special ornament that this person, that's their favorite gift that they get, or they got, and continues to get, or continues to get. Okay, Marie?
Gail?
Nope. Debbie?
Brittany.
Brittany. Brittany. I can give you more details now. Her mother, when her and Hector first got married, and Hector was married before he had his two kids, the first ornament had their two names and the two kids' names, and each year after they had the babies, she gives a new one with the new babies' names on it and stuff like that. So she said it makes her cry every year. So anyway, congratulations. So we have 3 big events coming up. 3 big events for this age group. The first thing is next Wednesday. We're doing a potluck during lunch. That's usually when y'all go out for lunch. And talk to Linda. We're just going to do it here too, since she's not able to, be with us. So we're going to do it here. So I need everybody to bring stuff, and that'll be our potluck lunch during Bible study next week. And the week after, during the Wednesday, will be our party like we did last year, with Christmas cookies and games and all that stuff. So we'll have lots of fun, prizes and all that good stuff. And then the Monday night, the 13th, we're going on a Christmas light tour. We're taking the bus, so it's bus only holds like 24 people. So you got to sign up and register for that, okay? So it's the Monday the 13th, we're going out to to Virginia Beach, oceanfront, looking at the lights, and then hitting lights on the way back. So from 5:30 to 8:30. It'll be a lot of fun. All right? Any questions?
Is it on the boardwalk?
Yes, the lights on the boardwalk. It's really expensive when you do
It
one
is
person.
$25 or something.
But a bus load, the whole top bus is only $40.
Wow, that's.
So with so we're getting drinks and snacks for y'all along the way, and it's just a lot cheaper to go.
And hot
to
chocolate?
You're bringing the hot chocolate. All right, Donna. I think it wouldn't be hot after 3 hours. Don't you? Yes, Jill?
Steve, I have a question. I know that Bible study is gonna not
meet a few times during the month of December.
Uh-huh.
Could somebody clarify when that is, because everybody.
It's
out
the
there
last
is-
2 Wednesdays in December. It's the 22nd and the 29th.
Those are the two.
That we're not meeting, correct.
Okay. Hey, this is a seniors, Joe.
Donna?
Yeah.
I just have a question about the cookies. Do we bring cookies? Do we all bring cookies?
Oh, yeah, for that party?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we always bring cookies.
Yeah, I'll give you more instructions about that as we get
Okay.
closer, but yeah. Last year, people brought all different types of baked goods, their favorite stuff there.
Okay, this is about growing old. A distraught senior citizen phoned her doctor's office. Is it true, she wanted to know, that this medication you prescribed has to be taken for the rest of my life? Yes, I'm afraid so, the doctor told her. There was a moment of silence before the senior lady replied, I'm wondering then, just how serious is my condition, because the prescription is marked no refills. An older gentleman was on the operating table waiting surgery, and he insisted that his son, a renowned surgeon, perform the operation. As he was about to get the anesthesia, he asked to speak to his son. Yes, Dad, what is it? Don't be nervous, son. Do your best. And just remember, if it doesn't go well, if something happens to me, your mother is going to come and live with you and your wife. And this is a short one, I hope you don't get offended. But it says, first you forget your name, then you forget your faces, then you forget to pull up your zipper. It's worse when you forget to pull it down.
Well, that doesn't apply to us, thank God.
Okay. This is called burnt biscuits. When I was a kid, my mom liked to make breakfast food for dinner every now and then. As I remember one night in particular when she had made breakfast after a long, hard day at work. On that evening so long ago, my mom placed a plate of eggs, sausage, extremely burnt biscuits in front of my dad. I remember waiting to see if anyone noticed. Yet all my dad did was reach for his biscuit, smile at my mom, and ask me how my day was at school. I don't remember what I told him that night, but I do remember watching him smear butter and jelly on that ugly burnt biscuit. He ate every bite of that thing, never made a face, nor uttered a word about it. When I got up from the table that evening, I remember hearing my mom apologize to my dad for burning the biscuits. And I'll never forget what he said. Honey, I love burnt biscuits every now and then. Later that night, I went to kiss my dad goodnight, and I asked him if he really liked his biscuits burnt. He wrapped me in his arms and he said, your mom put in a hard day at work today, and she's really tired. And besides, a little burnt biscuits never hurt anyone. As I've grown older, I thought about this many times. Life is full of imperfect things and imperfect people. I'm not the best at hardly anything. I forget birthdays, anniversaries, just like everyone else. But what I learned over the years is learning to accept each other's faults and choosing to celebrate each other's differences is one of the most important keys to creating a healthy, growing, and lasting relationship. We need to learn to take the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of our life and lay them at the feet of God. Because in the end, He's the only one who will be able to give you a relationship where a burnt biscuit isn't a deal breaker. One, don't put the key to your happiness in someone else's pocket. Keep it in your own. Be kinder than necessary, because everybody you meet is fighting some kind of battle. And life without God is like an unsharpened pencil. It has no point.
Well, those lessons are good enough for the day. We're going to close in prayer. I like the little wisdom that she gives right at the end of each of those. And then she gave me some some pointers too, some help. You'll remember when she did the thing where the women, words that you should be looking for when it comes to responses from the ladies. 9 words that women use and men really need to understand. Fine, nothing. So I have my cheat sheet. This is good. Grateful for
Well, it
that.
wasn't for you, it was for
It was,
other people.
of course, yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. No, in fact, I wouldn't have a problem with that even today, right before we had our lesson time. Crystal is leaving as we speak. She's going out to Hampton, where she's supposed to have another surgery on a spot on her nose that we had previously found skin cancer on, and they didn't seem to get the whole thing last time. So she's leaving for that. And I didn't have presence of mind, because I'm going from one thing to another, to be like, honey, I hope it goes well, you know, give her a hug, things like that. I'm okay, honey, we'll see you. She's like, okay, well, I'll go to my surgery now, I hope it goes well. So it was one of those fine moments that I should have been aware of. So yeah, nobody's perfect, that's for sure. That's something we've learned from the lessons today already. Speaking of nobody being perfect, we're going to look at the life of an imperfect king, actually a couple of imperfect kings, but one becomes pretty obvious as we get into it today. We're looking mainly in the life of Saul, as we are in the second week, our second lesson from this Life of David study that we're going through, based on Swindoll's book, Man of Passion and Destiny. Everybody have the blanks. Anybody who is missing them that would like to have some, we have extra copies up here. So we've got some blanks we'll go through here, but we're going to be talking mostly today about King Saul. And Linda says hey to everybody. She's online joining us. So hello, Linda. We miss you. We hope you're recovering well. So we're jumping into King Saul's life, and here's some things to be aware of. A little bit of a review from last time. In the beginning, Saul appeared to be perfect for the throne of Israel. That's what we talked about a lot last week. Why was it that he seemed to be perfect for Israel? Anybody have any ideas on that? I'll turn these lights on to help us. Yes, appearance was such a huge part of that. The reasons why Saul seemed to be perfect for Israel. If you'll remember, we talked about how the Israelites wanted to have things like all the other countries had when it came to a physical representation of their power and even of God's authority. They wanted to have the king that was that instead of God being their king, because at that point God didn't have skin on. So it was something that they desired. And so to find a king that represented their country well and God, he had to be tall, dark, and handsome. He had to fit the bill physically. And so they seem to have found that in Saul. Not only that, he appeared to be humble as he ascended to the throne, but that changed fairly quickly. After becoming king of Israel, eventually something seemed to snap in his mind during the later years, later being a blank there, the latter years of his reign. He started to lose touch with reality. And you're going to see some signs of this as we get into a little bit of Saul's, the detail of his life. But he became selfish, he became angry, hateful, mean-spirited. Very different than how he was even in the beginning of his reign as a king over Israel, the first king. So not long after Saul began his reign, Samuel is the prophet of God during Saul's time. And you'll notice all through the Old Testament, you would have generally a leader who is in charge of the military and the political force of Israel. But then you also had a prophet who advised that king or judge, whichever time period you're looking at. And so prophet had a job, the king had a job, the priests had their job of offering sacrifices, and that pattern of leadership existed all through the Old Testament, which we actually talked about a little bit in a previous sermon recently, of how now we in Christ fulfill those positions as prophets, priests, and kings. But that was how authority was divided among God's leaders in the Old Testament. So you had your king Saul and you had your prophet Samuel. Now Samuel is trying to get Saul to toe the line as God's king, and it's not working really well at all. And you really see those problems come up in 1 Samuel chapters 13 through 15. We don't have time to go through all those chapters, but just to summarize the mistakes that Saul made in that period. The first one was a terrible decision. That decision was basically to not wait for Samuel's blessing before going into battle. He and his men were ready to go in. This is a time when Saul was finding victory in battle, and he was wanting to rush into situations, and then there were some difficult ones that he didn't want to wait on. And in this particular situation, he is wanting to go into this battle, and he's waiting on Samuel to show up. And you see in this is 1 Samuel 13, verse 13, Samuel responds to him. Basically what Saul was waiting for was for Samuel to come and to provide a burnt offering so that it would go well for them in battle. And instead of waiting, Saul offered the burnt offering for the men himself instead of waiting on Samuel to do that. And so then Samuel shows up, verse 11. He asks him, "What have you done?" Saul says, "When I saw the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time, and the Philistines are assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." Samuel says, "You acted foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord God gave you." So Saul, reacting to what he's seeing instead of what he has heard as far as God's commandment on how they were to enter into battle, acted rashly with this terrible decision. That is one of the first cracks in the armor with Saul. Then in the next chapter, you see Saul making a rash vow against his own son. Saul, in his growing paranoia and desire to seek his own power, to increase his own power, became kind of crazy when it came to going into battles, and even the way he saw the reason for their going into battles. Like, for instance, 1 Samuel 14, verse 24, "The men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, 'Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies.' So none of the troops tasted food." These are men who are actively in battle. Saul is saying, "You don't get to eat until we win this battle." That doesn't work. That's not a great way to ingratiate the people who are protecting you. And so these people are, the troops under Saul's leadership are totally discouraged. His own son, Jonathan, is one of those troops. He's not aware that Saul made this commandment, and he takes a little bit of honey off the tip of a spear and eats it. Well, word gets back to Saul about what's happening, that his own son had disobeyed his commandment as a king. And then you see down in verse 43, Saul says to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." Jonathan told him, "I merely tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." He wants his son to be put to death just by eating some honey because Saul had commanded his troops not to eat at all. See the paranoia, the thirst for power, and how delusional Saul is becoming as this king. So you see the terrible decision, a rash vow against his own son, and then you see open disobedience against God. So he openly disobeyed God in chapter 15. I've referred to this previously as well. This was kind of the final straw, if you will. One of the commands that God had for the Israelites is whenever you go into these foreign lands and you defeat these pagan kings, destroy everything. Don't take anything with you. Don't take these household idols, even though they're made of precious metal and maybe valuable and things like that, because it will influence you. And so we talked about how it's just part of our nature as humans to want to go after physical things in our worship as opposed to worshiping the invisible God. God, being aware of that, made that very clear in this time that they were not to take on these other physical possessions because of the impact it would have. Well, Saul and his army decided to keep the best of everything, the best of the livestock, the best of the spoils of war. And so Samuel's reaction to that is fairly severe. in verse 22, he confronts Saul, and it's interesting what he says to him. He says in chapter 15, verse 22, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I've sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin, and come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king of Israel." So that was the final straw. At this point, Samuel is going to move on in a different direction for another king. So that's kind of a summary of Saul's downfall as a king. And when Samuel confronted Saul, he at first tried to rationalize what Saul responded with was to try to rationalize what he had done. Then Saul admitted that he was wrong, and then he qualified his confession in those verses there, in verses 24 and 25. Right? So first he confesses, and then he says, "I was afraid." So he's basically saying, here's the rationalization for my sin. I was afraid of people. I gave in to them. And so it's not a full confession, essentially. It's basically saying, here's why it makes sense for me to disobey God. And so now it's obvious that Saul is really more concerned about his image than he is being faithful. And even by asking Samuel to come back with him when he's going back to the people, he wanted the image of God's prophet next to him so he looked good in front of the people. He's way more concerned about his image than he is anything else. And this becomes obvious as he's making these requests. So Samuel doesn't buy it. His response was this unforgettable rebuke that we just saw, that the kingdom will be taken away from him, not to be returned. And then even after that, Saul still rationalizes. So like in verse 30, Saul replied, "I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." Once again, okay, you can have the kingdom, but please make sure I look good in front of everybody. So Samuel went back with Saul. Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him confidently, thinking, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother may be childless among women." And Samuel put Agag to death before the sword at Gilgal. And then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So this is the end of Saul, if you will, as far as his relationship with God and also God's prophet Samuel. So even though Samuel goes through that ritual act of worship with Saul, he sees through the whole thing, basically tells Saul, "This is the last day I'm going to see you." And sure enough, to the end of his life, never saw Saul again. So did you guys get that last blank there? His response was an unforgettable rebuke. So we have confession and then rebuke. And according to the geography, Saul went one way and Samuel went home the other direction, and they never met again until the day of Saul's death. The tragedy is that Saul never really fully repented of his sin. You're going to see this all through the time that David ascends to the throne, and Saul is still trying to hold on to the vestige of leadership that he feels he still has, though he has been clearly told right here, "You are no longer king of Israel." He's going to act as if. It's almost like he will forget that Samuel said this to him. So his greatest concern was his image until the day he died. Now, Samuel has done this, confidently pronounced God's judgment on Israel's king, and turns around right after that and panics. Samuel does a little bit of panicking at this point. That's a blank. Panics. Saul is not fit to be king. And there's no one that Samuel knows of who's going to replace Saul. So what's he going to do? This is the concern. But God, of course, was already ready. He already knew what was going to happen, and God was prepared for this. And we're going to see how that happens. How man panics, but God provides. Which I think is another blank. Man panics, God provides. Before God ever flung stars into the sky, God had today in mind. God has the ability, as an all-knowing, all-powerful God, to not only create this universe, but be able to tell you what happens at any given moment within it. Past, present, and future. So God already knew about today before today happened. In the same way, God knew this situation would come up, and He was ready. He's never at a loss to know what to do in these situations. But this is what we do. God, if you'll reveal to me, what the future holds, then I'll be in great shape. If you can just show me, then I can handle the situation. Explain your plan to me, and I'll count on you after that. See, we like to not just follow God blindly, trusting for the future. We like to kind of get hints from God what the future will be, and that's when we'll follow Him after that. That's not exactly faith. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and being certain of what we do not see. And so, example of that is, I talked about just Sunday how God's been faithful to us through the past, couple of years, especially when it comes to just the finances for the church and ministries that are happening here. And then even as of Sunday, we talked about that whole offering going towards Love Our City, to the community, to service projects that we're doing all around our area. So that would mean 0 goes to church funds and things like that as a result. Well, I was still kind of shaking in my boots about that because behind the scenes there was a little bit of an email that circulated about, hey, not sure how much of a cash reserve we have to be able to do this kind of thing. Are we sure we want to pull this off? Well, let's have faith. Let's move forward. So long story short, Monday I come back in and find out that our offering, our hope was, average offerings around $12,000 or so here per week. Our hope was that we would get about $11,000 to go towards Love Our City. We got $22,000. It was double. It was double what we were, to the dollar almost, what we were hoping for. And then our bookkeeper, Stephanie, said, oh, and by the way, I missed something in this last email that I sent you. There was a whole lot of this money that came from online giving that had not added to that total figure that I sent. We seem to be fine. We're in the black. Everything's good. We've got cash reserve, and we have more than what we had expected to pull in for this community event. God's faithful. And you trust Him. Even sometimes it seems foolish to trust Him that way, but if you know you're trying to do God's will and His work in the world, He does come through and He is faithful.
You can't outgive God. Right?
No, you can't. Even if it means that you may be sweating a little bit in the meantime as a result of that. So it was just neat to see that happening. And we're actually going to put a video announcement to everybody just thanking folks for their faithfulness this past Sunday for that. And just looking forward to what God's going to do in the remainder of this year. All right, moving forward. Here we go. So Isaiah 65:24, I won't read that, but basically what it says there is before God ever uttered a word that He is involved in, or before we ever utter a word to God, that He's involved in the answering of our prayers. Doesn't mean that we don't pray. It means that God anticipates our prayers and can answer them and see us through. And so we'll see how God reveals Himself to Samuel in this situation, who's a little panicky, if you remember, not knowing who's going to be the next king. So that's where we pick it up. In 1 Samuel, we'll spend most of our time in chapter 16 with the time that we have left, which is quickly passing. Chapter 16, verse 1 says, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. So God answers, but Samuel's going to question. So there's a blank. God answers, but Samuel questions. Now God was already at work. He was choosing a man for himself. We see how that's true in verse 1. But then when you read into verses 2 through 4, but Samuel said, how can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. Samuel did what the Lord said, and when he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? Now, you see how everybody's afraid? Because Saul is just so unstable. Samuel doesn't want to leave Saul's side because he knows Saul's going to ask him, where is he going and why is he going? And so God is telling him, hey, you're going to provide an offering and you're going to do it at this man's house, at Jesse's house. And so that's what God had instructed him to do. So from a human perspective, Samuel was right to be worried. He had this paranoid king who could have very easily killed him on a whim. But from a different perspective of faith, God's going to get him through. God already knew about Saul, and the ironic thing is that God is going to use Saul to train David in the years between being a shepherd and being a king. David, not to spoil the story at all, but David is the son of Jesse that Samuel's going to end up finding. And it's just going to be extraordinary when you see the providence of God, of how David becomes a right-hand man to Saul for a period of time, to help him give David an opportunity to see what it's like to be in the throne room, in this position of authority from where he used to be, which was just in the fields as a shepherd with the sheep. So God's providence led to David being raised up into that place as a king. So you may have some Sauls in your life, some folks who you feel like maybe scraping your nerves a little bit, or it could be causing you to worry. But notice, God used Saul to train David. So, it is quite possible that this person in your life, the EGR, the extra grace required person, is there for a purpose that God has in mind for you that you may not even be aware of yet. So that's the thing to keep in mind as we go through this.
God has a sense of humor.
He does. He does. And I love the ironies that continue to come up as we see His providence. So the Lord doesn't even answer Samuel's remark about Saul. It doesn't even really say anything about whether or not he's going to be put to death. He just says, go do this. And God doesn't want us to be smarter than Him. He wants us just to obey. You'll see this over and over again in the Scripture. He doesn't necessarily explain Himself all the time. He just says, follow me. And maybe it'll make sense afterwards, right? But it's through that obedience that we do start to make connections. So David, meanwhile, is out in the field with the sheep, clueless as to what's happening. He's out keeping sheep. There's a blank. So Samuel does what the Lord said. Arrives at Bethlehem. The elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? Samuel replied, yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Okay, so Eliab being the one that seems to look the part, which is all the rage when you're looking for kings these days. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So man chooses, God corrects. All right, so all the problems in the Oval Office are making the folks in the countryside uneasy as Samuel shows up in this town. They're afraid of why Samuel might have come. There's a blank. And so they go through the process of consecrating, and they're not really sure why all that consecration is happening or what's about to happen. And then they knew that something big was about to happen. Samuel, if he's showing up to anoint someone, then that means someone is most likely going to be rising to that position. But they know about Saul. That's why they're scared. So they're still trying to figure things out as they go. So then you have exhibits 1 through 7 going by. Those are the 7 sons of Jesse. And Samuel learns about God's method of choosing kings in verse 7, which is not the outward appearance, but the heart. Wouldn't it be great to be able to see people's hearts before you saw their face? It would make things simpler for us, wouldn't it? But only God can do that, so we rely on Him. We remember that God had said that He had already chosen His man, and He said back in chapter 13 that He was looking for someone after His own heart. So the first time Samuel rebuked Saul, Samuel says this to Saul, that God will choose for him a man after His own heart. This comes back around again when God is explaining to Samuel why He's not choosing these other sons. Quoting what Samuel had already said earlier. As you remember, it's not the outward appearance, but it's the heart that I'm looking after. Someone after my own heart. So He'd chosen this man. He already has him in mind. It's significant, though, that this person is not even in the room. What's significant about that is his own dad, Jesse, is like, not this kid, not the runt. He's choring. He's out there with the sheep, because that's what he's good for, right? All right, so man chooses, but God corrects. Man forgets, and God remembers. So it continues verses 11 through 19. It says, so he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "They're still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but he's tending the sheep." And Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. The only description we have of David there. But compared to Saul, he's not kingly in the same way. Just ruddy. A little different.
Chris, mine says here, mine says here, oh, I lost it. He was glowing with health.
Glowing with health. Fair enough. He's probably the one that works the hardest among the sons.
Yeah, he's been outside all day.
Yeah, he's running. He's got a good tan he's been working on. So he's got the handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, he is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. Okay? Important you notice that. David is now anointed as the king. He's officially the king of Israel. In God's eyes, the Spirit is on David as the king of Israel, but he's far from taking the throne. So now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. This is a pretty controversial verse. Evil spirit from the Lord? What? Now that's where you have like the footnotes, like in a lot of translations and footnote here, injurious spirit. What would be translated as evil in other places, they kind of tweaked it a little bit and said injurious spirit or harmful spirit from the Lord. But from this, what we can see is not necessarily that God creates evil, but evil can be allowed in this world, and God certainly can send trials. He can send even spirits that are in charge of those types of trials. And this is what's happening with Saul. Now Saul had already, before this had taken place, gone in the direction of paranoia and rejecting God and seeking after his own image. And God is taking the momentum that Saul already started of rejecting and self-seeking and basically allowing it to take its full force. So he's just going to get worse. In the same way that the Pharaoh's heart was hardened when he continually said no. So Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better." So these are their techniques of therapy for things like anxiety and such in that time. So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." Who could that be? One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp." He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man. And the Lord is with him. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. So, Samuel has God's perspective. Doesn't matter how young the boy is or what he does. There's no rest until the king is found. We're not going to sit down until he comes in from the field. Samuel then anoints him. This teenager, basically, who walks in the house smelling like sheep, right? And at this point, Samuel's an old man who hobbles over and pours oil over David's head. Josephus is the most accurate Jewish historian that we have on record, and he says that the old man likely whispered into the boy's ear the meaning of the symbol of the oil being on David. You know, these are early days of people being made into kings, so anointing people with oil is not something that folks were very familiar with. So, David could have been aware all the way from that point on, according to Josephus he would have been, of the fact that he was king of Israel. Well, what do you do as soon as someone calls you the king of the land, the president of the United States? Are you shot for, you know, a nice tie, a nice desk? Is David going to be looking for the perfect crown? You know, what do you do? What David did next tells a lot about why God actually chose him to serve in the way that he did. So what David did tells a lot about why God chose him. Verses 17 through 19 shows us what he did. And those last three words of verse 19 are crucial. Basically, it says, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. That means after he was anointed, David went right back out to the field and went back to choring with the sheep. And then you see this projected on into chapter 17 when you see the big giant who is challenging the Israelites, the Philistine giant named Goliath. What's David doing when Goliath is shouting his insults and challenges to the Israelites? David is out in the fields with the sheep. And Jesse even sends him as the water boy to his brothers. So it's almost as if Samuel never showed up and anointed him king, but he did. And so it's just great to see this humility in David so far. So David ends up being the king's musician and the next in line to the throne, but he's still tending his father's flock. And to the point where he actually, people had to pull David away from the sheep to get him to do anything that was related to what he was called to do in the limelight as a king. So the man after God's heart was always approachable, always believable, always authentic, and always faithful in the little things. You will see this pattern in David's life, even in the worst days. David is far from perfect, as we began this lesson talking about. But what we see throughout even the difficult times in his life is some authenticity, faithfulness. So here's some lessons to learn. God speaks, we respond. 3 lessons to learn. 1, God's solutions are often strange and simple, so be open. God's solutions are often strange and simple, so be open. When God says, go to this man's house and I will show you who it's going to be, that probably sounded kind of weird to Samuel, but sure enough, Samuel went to this shepherding family and found the king. God's promotions are usually sudden and surprising, so be ready. That was certainly the case for David. This is how it works. You have this long period of time where it seems like you're just kind of going through your days, and then all of a sudden something happens, and everything that you've been doing and working on and thinking through lines up in such a way that you see God working in the midst of it. So this is what happens for David. God's selections are always sovereign and sure, so be sensitive. So this applies to life decisions that we make, moving from one place to another, being led to relationships with one person or another. All of that requires, I think, a sensitivity to God's wisdom and His sovereignty. I want to finish by reading a little bit at the end of this before we get into our prayer. A little bit at the end of the 2nd chapter, which is where this lesson comes from out of the book. Swindoll writes, "The year 1809 was a very good year. Of course, those who were alive at that year didn't know it. Only history tells the story. Those who were living in 1809 were focused on Napoleon, who was marching across Austria like a fire across a Kansas wheat field. As hamlets, villages, and cities fell into his grip, people began to wonder if all the world would someday fall into his hands. During that same period of time, thousands of babies were born in Britain and in America, but who cared about babies and bottles and cribs and cradles while Napoleon was doing his thing in Austria? Well, someone should have cared, because in 1809, William Gladstone was born in Liverpool, Alfred Tennyson began his life in Lincolnshire, Oliver Wendell Holmes cried out for the first time in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A few miles away in Boston, Edgar Allan Poe began his brief, tragic sojourn on Earth. That same year, Charles Robert Darwin and Robert Charles Winthrop wore their first diapers. And in a little log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, an illiterate laborer and his wife named their newborn son Abraham Lincoln. The lives of these statesmen, writers, and thinkers would mark the genesis of an era. But nobody cared about those nobodies while Napoleon was moving across Austria. The strange thing is, today, only history buffs could name one battle that Napoleon fought in Austria. But there's not a life of a person today that has not been touched in some way by the lives of those men I've just named. Nobody noticed. If you and I had been Jews living in the year 1020 BC, the same could have been said of us. All of our attention would have been focused upon a man named Saul, the first king of Israel. He was the focal point of the Jewish world at that time. He was taking the country by storm. Meanwhile, a nobody was keeping the sheep for his father on the Judean hillsides near the hamlet of Bethlehem. A little boy named David, whom nobody noticed except God." All right? So, when you feel like your life is not big enough or nobody's paying attention, just be aware that God is always, His eyes range all throughout the earth, seeking the people whose hearts are fully devoted to Him. And He found that in David, and hopefully He finds that in us as well. So just be ready for whatever God has in store for you. It could come out of the blue.